What's up everybody, it's Paul from Boosted Films, and in this video we're going to get the Silver EVO back on the dyno. I'm going to show you the one change I made to it to gain over 25 horsepower and over 40 foot-pounds of torque. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison between my black EVO and the Silver EVO and get a little breakdown as to why they might be making the different power levels they are. So it was almost 2 years ago that I finished up the build of the Silver EVO and got it running. The engine had its 500-mile break-in. I had to replace the fuel tank in that time. And then I got it over to ASM to have Andy put a tune on it. But like with all builds and stuff, there's a lot of things you need to factor in. There's a lot of things you can do. And the one thing I didn't really account for, I guess, or think about was changing out the stock O2 housing at the time. So on that initial dyno tune, we ended up with only about 344 horsepower and about 357 foot-pounds of torque. And this was down pretty significantly from my black EVO from the time I had that on this dyno. So I was kind of thinking, we figured the limiting factor here was that O2 housing. So probably only a month or two after I had the car on the dyno initially, I did swap out that O2 housing for an STM O2 eliminator downpipe. And fast forward to just last week, about 2 years after the initial build got together, and we got the car back on the dyno. So here's a better look at the dyno graph from just a week ago, and you can see from 2021 to 2023, we went from about 344 horsepower to about 371, and then our torque went from about 357 to 401. But of course, I do want to point out that there's a lot of different factors that come into play when your car is on the dyno. The weather that day, different things with that dyno could have changed, obviously, in these past few years. Little things with the car. So this is really kind of just meant to be more fun, but it's also interesting to me just to actually see, some of these differences just from, changing this one part on the car. Now, I didn't have the best shot of this, but I did take a photo of an overlay of a different dyno run. The one in blue is one of the runs from 2 years ago, and the lines in green are the runs from just last week. So again, similar results. You'll see I actually had a bit more torque on this particular pull, so it looks like you're only gaining about 30 foot-pounds of torque instead of that 40. But again, every run can be different. The dyno itself is always really just kind of meant to be a tool for you to actually, tune your car. And then I also just like it for being able to kind of see where my power band is. And of course, most of you are probably saying, well, that's a duh moment too. The stock O2 housing, swapping that out, having something limit the flow that close to the turbo is obviously not something you want. So I know it's kind of obvious that this should make a big difference, but I also think it's cool just to actually be able to do this one change and then have these proven results. But now let's take a comparison to my black 2003 EVO to my silver 2003 EVO. They're both running on OEM short blocks, although the silver one has way less miles than the black one. They're both running the same camshafts. We got GSC S1s and Evo 9 turbos on each car with a Grim Speed electronic boost controller. I'm actually pushing about 30 PSI, or at least spiking to 30, usually leveling off around 27, sometimes tapering off a little bit more into the very high RPMs. 1200cc high Z injectors, a fuel pump, obviously running E85, and they both have ARP head studs. But the bottom 4 items on this list is where things start to differentiate, and this is where I think it's just fun to have a discussion. I definitely don't claim to be an expert as to what makes actually everything have more horsepower or work together the best, but these are the differences. The black EVO has a Spearco front mount intercooler. I think it's been pretty well proven that a lot of aftermarket intercoolers are going to do better than OEM, so it makes sense that the black car is probably gaining a little bit of horsepower just from having that better intercooler. But one spot I think does actually really make a difference still is the exhaust. I think this Busher exhaust does just flow really well and seems to work really well with that Evo 9 turbo. This busher exhaust is quite a bit louder than that HKS exhaust that I have on the Silver EVO, so that also kind of makes sense to me that the more free-flowing one is going to be a little bit louder. And then when it comes to the O2 housing, I still, of course, have an O2 housing on the Black EVO, but I don't know what brand name it is. It was just one I found used, and it's got the external dump coming out the hood. And I do get a feeling that this just O2 housing works very well. And on the Silver EVO, of course, we have the STM O2 eliminator downpipe, except the external dump is going down instead of up. And of course, it works. It worked a lot better than the original O2 housing, the OEM O2 housing that used to have a busher downpipe attached to it. But again, I just get this feeling that potentially the external dump setup that I have with this O2 housing on my Black EVO might just work really well with this full busher exhaust and with this Evo 9 Turbo. And it's still just worth mentioning too that the air intake pipes are a little bit different. I have a Dijon Tool air intake pipe on the Black EVO with a K&N filter, and on the Silver EVO, it's an engine air intake with a K&N filter. All right, so now let's take a look at some dyno results comparing both of these cars. Again, I need to point out that every dyno session is different. A lot of factors come into play. So this is still just mostly for fun. I also truly believe that if you look at the left graph from my Black EVO, this is from 2020. This is from very, very early on when ASM got their dyno. And I do believe they've recalibrated it since to actually bring the numbers down to probably where, closer to where they should be. It was basically reading a bit high from what I understand. So I'm guessing these are still about 20 horsepower, 20 torque off from the real numbers. But I definitely do think, this Black EVO has more power and it seems to be a faster car than the silver one. And also what's interesting to me is actually just looking at the peak horsepower and peak torque and the RPMs where they occur. The Black EVO, it's higher in the RPM band, which I actually kind of like. It just seems to balance out pretty well. The only issue maybe there, and it might just be my driving style or drivetrain related, but I've noticed sometimes with my 1-2 shift, if I'm trying to drag race, my 1-2 shift, I can sometimes more likely fall out of boost in the black car than I would in the silver one. So again, there's a lot of factors there. It could be more to do with the clutch or more to do with my driving. But I think peak torque being 1,000 RPMs lower does kind of tell me that I am probably less likely to kind of screw up that shift because I probably have power a little bit sooner, whereas I need to be a little more accurate with my shifting in the black car to not fall out of boost or fall out of power doing that 1-2 shift. But I don't know. Honestly, that's just me rambling with my thought process. I'm really not an expert here, but I'm curious your thoughts and your opinions in this area, especially actually when it comes to the front mount intercooler. Has anyone actually seen over 400 horsepower on a stock front mount intercooler? I'm curious if any of you other Evo owners know how much horsepower you can actually really put out with that stock front mount intercooler. And then what are your thoughts on the exhaust? I mean, do you think that just having that busher exhaust is really making that much of a difference? If I had all the time in the world, I would love to take the exhaust off the black car, put it in the silver one, throw it on the dyno and see, how much of a difference it makes. And more importantly, probably maybe go the other way, put the HKS exhaust, catback exhaust onto the Black EVO, see where my power would end up at. I think that'd be very interesting to do. But either way, what I love about both of these cars and the setup with both of them with this stock turbo, around 3,500 RPM, already looking at about 350 foot-pounds of torque, which is great. The RPM or the horsepower at higher RPM seems to be retaining pretty well, dropping off after about 6,500 RPM. But it just seems like such a great setup to have a decent amount of horsepower and a decent amount of torque from, for that whole power band of about 3,500, pretty much all the way up to redline. Either way, I just really love both these cars, but I guess if I had to totally redo and copy a build completely, I would really kind of obviously do what the black car is doing here with this exhaust setup, with this intercooler setup. It's working really well and I really like it. But I'd love to know your thoughts. I know there's a lot of smart people out there on the internet. I know a lot of you guys have Evos. What do you think about this peak horsepower, being about 700 RPMs later, this peak torque, coming on later? Why do you think that is? Do you think the exhaust is making that much, of a difference on where your peak numbers occur? Is that just more of a fluky thing? So there you go, guys. That is about it for this video. I just find this stuff fascinating. I love to be able to compare results. Hopefully you guys found this at least entertaining, if not a bit informative as well. So of course, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. And yeah, of course, leave your comments. Everyone check the comments too for updates to the video or people, you know, that had to correct me on something I said wrong. As always, this is Paul from Boosted Films saying thanks so much for watching.